me revient l'honneur donc d'ouvrir cette séance plénière consacrée au recours au droit dans les nouvelles formes d'action collective, legal recourse in the new forms of collective action. Avant de passer la parole à Liora Israël, qui a bien voulu se charger donc d'introduire ce thème choisi, ceci à partir d'une connaissance approfondie de l'état du savoir au niveau international sur ce thème. Il me faudra rappeler simplement très rapidement peut-être les raisons du choix de ce thème pour ce congrès. Donc, I have the distinct honor to open this plenary session dedicated to legal recourse in the new forms of collective action. Before passing the floor to Liora Israël, maîtresse de conférence at the École des hautes études en sciences sociales à Paris, in Paris. We will introduce the chosen team, of which she has deep knowledge and in international perspective. I wish simply to reiterate the reasons for the selection of this team for the Congress. It's a framework of a Congress dedicated to the positioning of sociology of law in relation political action and consequently to the analysis of connections between law and politics. It seemed important to look into one of the possible expressions of this connection: legal recourse in collective mobilizations. Consequently, our proposed analytical perspective is in fact to seek to break with the representation of law as a reference and to privilege approach where law is perceived by the organizing forces within civil society as a resource in civilist tradition, as in common law tradition. But I shall not go any further other than to recall the intention that led to the choice of this theme before leaving the floor to Liora Israël. Donc je n'irai pas plus loin, mais que le rappel très rapide donc, de l'intention qui a présidé au choix de ce thème. Et je vais très vite donc passer la parole à Liora Israël, qui est chargée de l'introduction du thème de cette première séance plénière. Simplement un mot pour évoquer l'organisation de la séance, a word on the organization of the session. After the stimulating introduction by Liora Israël, I have no doubts about. The floor will be given to my friend Moussa Abou Ramadan, currently a professor at the Carmel Academic Center, is that right? In Haïfa, and to professor at the University of Strasbourg in France, who had the great pleasure to get to know during my trips to Birzeit University in Palestine while he taught there. Moussa Abou Ramadan's presentation is entitled Ouléma du Palais, Révolution arabe et droit musulman. Palace Ouléma, Arab revolutions and Muslim law, is right? Yeah. Okay. Our colleague Zangier, professor and deputy director at the Institute of Sociology of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, will then present a paper, The Improvement of a Migrant Worker's Life Conditions after the issuing of the labor contract law. Finally, we will hear Boaventura de Sousa Santos, professor at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, at the University of Wisconsin, Madison Law School, Professor Santos will deliver his empirical and theoretical reflections on toward a sociology of indignation, an analysis of movements of the indignados of Southern Europe, and of the Occupy movement in the United States, with a perspective of a new critical legal theory. Unfortunately, he could not be present with us today, and so we have asked Patricia Branco. we are waiting for him, for her, a brilliant researcher at the Social Studies Center of the University of Coimbra, to read the paper Boaventura sent us. Of course, after the presentation, each presentation, we anticipate question and answer with a general debate to finish this session. As you have perhaps noticed, we have taken the risk of tackling this theme with colleagues from different regions of the world. After all, this question remains: how this perspective of a new politics of law is manifested in various contexts and different cultures, as well in the context of globalization.
So I write my paper in French, and I will try to summarize the main arguments, if there are arguments. So I will come back and forth from French to English. Je voudrais tout d'abord donc remercier de m'avoir proposé de discuter cette plénière aux organisateurs du colloque, en particulier Wanda Capeller, l'organisatrice scientifique de cette manifestation. Je voudrais les remercier notamment d'avoir pensé à mettre ce beau sujet ô combien d'actualité comme thème de réflexion de nos rencontres. Donc, parler de nouvelles formes de mobilisation collective et de recours au droit dans les nouvelles formes de mobilisation collective, voilà à la fois une formule qui nous parle et qui pose immédiatement un certain nombre de questions aux chercheurs de sciences sociales. C'est une formule presque aussi insaisissable, parler de nouvelles formes de mobilisation collective, que celle qui, il y a 45 ans maintenant, décrivait les nouveaux mouvements sociaux, puisque évidemment, parler de nouveaux suppose que l'on puisse les situer par rapport à des anciens et ouvre à des débats un peu infinis. Et en même temps, cette comparaison implicite et par là même difficile ne devrait pas empêcher de mettre en exergue quelles sont les évolutions les plus récentes et quelles sont les transformations, notamment à l'échelle internationale, puisque c'est de cela que nous allons parler aujourd'hui, de ces mobilisations. So legal mobilization in new social movements, it's how I translated the title of the session in quite a different way than the one Jacques has chosen. And my first point in this introduction was to focus on the question of definition, to point out that to say what is, to talk about a new social movement would signify that we can know what is a whole social movement, of an ancient social movement, and this difference is all but simple. But if we are not speaking so strictly about boundaries and definition, anyway, we know that we have to take into account what is going on currently and all the trends that are happening in the world, notably in relation with the law and how law is handled in many occasions when movements such as the Occupy that we mentioned or the Indignados are acting everywhere. So new trends emerge in the last decades, and most notably in the last few years, the use of new technologies and social networks, of course, is to be noticed, especially in the Arab Springs, where they played a very important role. So français, il est donc difficile de décrire cette nouveauté des mobilisations, mais évidemment, il y a certaines dimensions saillantes, telles que le poids des nouvelles technologies, des réseaux sociaux et du web, qu'on a vu si important dans les printemps arabes. Je pensais notamment à une collègue qui a travaillé sur le cas de la Syrie lors des manifestations qui ont précédé l'actuel bain de sang, et elle avait notamment travaillé sur l'usage qu'ils ont fait des vidéos pour la transmission sur les réseaux sociaux, et elle avait montré que dans certaines manifestations, les banderoles étaient tournées vers l'arrière. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne manifestait pas pour un public, on manifestait pour les films qui après allaient être diffusés par le biais des téléphones sur Facebook et sur un certain nombre de réseaux. Donc le ton plus dramatique ou plus automnal qu'ont pris un certain nombre de ces printemps, et notamment la tragique situation syrienne actuelle, a remis en exergue deux faces du droit qu'il ne faut pas oublier ici et qui sont aussi tragiquement associées aux situations: la répression, parfois sous couvert de la légalité, et aussi, dans une autre perspective, le recours éventuel à une justice internationale du futur, très putative, que l'on appelle, mais malheureusement, il faut garder en mémoire, lorsque nous allons parler de mouvements sociaux et de protestations, que dans un certain nombre de cas, le droit national ou international reste bien impuissant. Néanmoins, donc, on va parler aujourd'hui d'un contexte qui reste moins dramatique, lorsque le maniement du droit reste possible et n'est pas totalement couvert par le bruit de la guerre. Dans ce contexte, les formes de mobilisation collective peuvent s'appuyer sur des outils juridiques et sur leurs professionnels dans un certain nombre de contextes. Donc, si la définition de la nouveauté des mobilisations reste problématique, tant cela dépend de l'échelle des temporalités que l'on met en œuvre et aussi donc de la focale que les chercheurs vont utiliser, deux enjeux peuvent bien sûr être identifiés, ont déjà été mis en évidence dans les travaux, notamment dans l'article de synthèse de Jacques et Laurence Dumoulin sur la judiciarisation. Donc deux dimensions. D'une part, si ce n'est un recours au droit plus fréquent, un recours au droit plus visible et par là même plus efficace sur le plan symbolique. Et symétriquement, une attention plus grande des chercheurs intéressés aux mouvements sociaux envers les usages du droit de manière générale, dont témoigne notamment notre congrès et son succès en termes de participation. So regarding law, two dimensions can be generally fostered. First, if not more frequent, because it's always difficult to say if it is more important or less important than in the past, at least the use of law is more visible. So it's more important also in terms of symbolic power. And second, which is also important to us, social scientists tend to pay more attention to this realm of action, including outside socio-legal studies, strictly speaking. So I think the interest toward law as a realm of action has really spread outside the limited number of researchers that were previously interested into legal phenomena, into legal mobilization. And one of the most important trends, of course, that I will focus on a little bit is the globalization of social movements, and consequently the globalization of legal mobilizations along several lines that I will try to identify in a minute. Okay? Donc les questions sur lesquelles on peut être amené à réfléchir sont les suivantes. Donc, je répète, donc un cadre un peu plus problématisé, le phénomène est-il nouveau ou simplement plus visible, je l'ai dit. Les sciences sociales sont-elles les enregistreurs de cette évolution ou participent-elles aussi de la mise en visibilité croissante de la place du droit? C'est évidemment des propositions qui sont toutes un peu vraies et dont on doit tenir compte dans notre position réflexive de chercheurs en sciences sociales, mais qui n'empêche pas, encore une fois, de tenter d'aller plus avant, de déplacer ces discussions sur la construction des problèmes pour identifier des dimensions de ces évolutions. donc une des dimensions majeures sur laquelle va porter la suite de mon intervention, c'est cette dimension de la mondialisation ou de la globalisation des mouvements sociaux. Là aussi, les sciences sociales et les travaux de sciences juridiques ont accompagné, ont réfléchi à ces questions, l'ont parfois anticipé ou s'en sont accommodés selon les cas, et des travaux importants ont déjà mis en exergue ce phénomène, comme le dictionnaire de la globalisation qu'a dirigé André-Jean Arnaud et qui témoigne bien de la richesse, aussi bien conceptuelle et empirique, des évolutions qui ont pu être mises en évidence lorsqu'on associe globalisation et droit, et très souvent mouvements sociaux comme troisième terme. Donc 3 questions, me semble-t-il, peuvent ressortir de ce triptyque, de cette réflexion sur les nouveaux usages du droit dans les mobilisations à l'aune de la globalisation. Une première dimension, un grand nombre de travaux ont cherché à mettre en évidence, sur une base souvent comparative, les évolutions du recours au droit par les mouvements sociaux, en s'intéressant particulièrement au rôle des juristes engagés. Et tout particulièrement, les travaux sur le cause lawyering qui ont été initiés par Sarah Teich-Scheingold se sont penchés, on le sait, sur les avocats qui partagent la cause de leurs clients, mais ces travaux, bien connus aujourd'hui, le sont moins pour cette dimension de l'internationalisation, de la transnationalisation qui est présente dès le début de ces recherches à la fin des années 90. Pour donner quelques exemples de travaux qui ont insisté sur ces points, Stephen Maley avait pointé la création de réseaux internationaux sur le continent sud-américain, permettant des échanges d'informations et du travail en commun. Je pense aussi au phénomène d'importation des pratiques militantes du droit qu'avait souligné Noga Morag-Levin lorsqu'il s'était intéressé à la transplantation des modèles des ONG de défense de l'environnement américaines sur le terrain israélien. Je pense aussi à la manière dont certains chercheurs, comme Lisa Hajar, ont travaillé sur l'importation de rhétorique en termes de droit international sur des terrains de lutte locaux, et elle avait notamment remarquablement travaillé sur la question des territoires occupés. So one of the most important trends that we have to focus on is, of course, the globalization of social movements. And in several types of research, we can really see how it was dealt with, how it was identified. For example, in the framework of the cause lawyering literature, there has been a focus since the beginning of this research in the late 1990s on international networking and solidarities among lawyers. For example, in South America, that Stephen Maley has really depicted very well. And as well, they also focus on a certain number of transplants that were made, transplants of ways of acting legally, of acting through law, that were often imported from the United States to other regions of the world. And Noga Morag-Levin brilliantly shown how it was done concerning in the field of environmental law in Israel by reference with the American way of doing stuff. And of course, the third line that has been dealt with by Lisa Hajar was the use of international law in local social movements, and she describes this for the struggle in the occupied territories against Israel on the basis of human rights and international law. Une deuxième dimension qui est intéressante dans les travaux de sciences sociales ou de droit qui se sont portés sur la question, c'est aussi la notion de forum shopping, sur laquelle ont notamment insisté les juristes belges Benoît Friedman et Ludovic Hennebel dans leur analyse stratégique du contentieux transnational des droits de l'homme. Alors forcément, la question des droits de l'homme est une question que je vais reprendre dans plusieurs exemples. Ils ont mis en évidence cette manière de faire qui, en fait, était traditionnellement assez classique pour les firmes multinationales, celle de choisir parmi les juridictions qui leur étaient accessibles, celle qui était a priori la plus favorable à leurs intérêts. Et le forum shopping est une sorte de translation de cette manière de faire pour les ONG internationales, notamment en cherchant à l'échelle du globe quel système judiciaire serait le plus à même de prendre en charge de façon satisfaisante une requête en cherchant quel juge national serait le plus susceptible de se saisir d'un problème en fonction des définitions de compétences, de l'indépendance variable des juges selon les pays, ou encore des possibilités de rattachement, si nécessaire, avec la situation nationale, pour le cas ou l'affaire qui est en jeu, sans que ce soit toujours nécessaire, comme le montre l'exemple de la compétence universelle. Donc les grandes ONG transnationales ou encore les organisations transnationales de juristes comme Sherpa, on connaît bien le travail de William Bourdon qu'on voit souvent dans les médias, se sont fait une spécialité de telles stratégies qui jouent en fait sur les différentiels d'opportunités judiciaires qui sont ouvertes dans les différents pays. So, the point that I tried to make, I have to find out where is my English again. Second, the new form of actions have to be noticed, such as a practice called forum shopping, that is used by forum shopping is a depiction of the type of activity that develop transnational NGOs to settle claims in the most appropriate legal setting in relation to their political goal. So they're really having strategies to try to find where a judge will be the more open-minded to the type of questions they want to raise. And it can be done at least in two domains. When you fight against a multinational corporation, meaning that they have branches in several countries, and also when you find in the domain of human rights, especially because of universal jurisdictions that exist in some countries regarding those issues. Et une troisième modalité caractéristique des articulations donc en plein développement depuis une vingtaine d'années entre droit, engagement et internationalisation concerne bien entendu le développement d'une justice pénale internationale, que ce soit par le biais de ces instances ad hoc ou aujourd'hui permanentes. En ouvrant la voie à des poursuites à l'égard d'un certain nombre de hauts responsables d'exactions dans leur pays, ces enceintes, malgré leur lourdeur, leurs imperfections et l'incomplétude souvent notée de leurs attributions, ont permis que se développent depuis les milieux des années 90 non seulement quelques procès, mais aussi de nouvelles formes de pratiques et d'expertise à l'appui de formes de reconnaissance et d'élucidation de crimes du passé plus ou moins proches pour le Cambodge, le Rwanda, la Sierra Leone, et donc l'accumulation d'une connaissance, si ce n'est une réelle lutte contre l'impunité, puisque le côté préventif ne semble malheureusement pas très bien fonctionner jusqu'ici. So I'm trying to focus on to mention also the development of international criminal law, not as such as having results in preventing new crimes, but at least in the constitution of new collective of international criminal lawyers dealing with those issues and building expertise on new crimes being committed and permitting to gather information, data, etc. Donc ces trois niveaux, les pratiques militantes du droit à différentes échelles, la construction de stratégies juridiques internationales jouant sur les droits nationaux et le développement d'un droit international, notamment dans le domaine pénal, constituent autant de déclinaisons au niveau du droit, et qui ne sont évidemment pas les seules, de l'internationalisation des mouvements sociaux. Leur essor indéniable en occulterait presque les pratiques plus quotidiennes, plus souterraines, mais aussi plus nombreuses, qui peuvent aussi s'appuyer sur le droit, dans l'invisibilité relative des petits tribunaux dont la jurisprudence n'est jamais visible, par la simple menace du recours au droit au niveau d'un guichet, dans la manière dont un délégué du personnel va s'appuyer sur les formations, peut-être de plus en plus teintées de droit, dispensées par son syndicat. Y a-t-il aussi des évolutions à ce niveau, des manières plus souterraines qu'auraient droit et mobilisation à s'acclimater l'un à l'autre? Quid de l'influence des mouvements de consommateurs depuis les 30 Glorieuses sur la manière dont les consommateurs revendiquent, depuis le travail en France de Louis Pinto, qui date un peu, et alors que les grandes firmes n'ont cessé de rendre plus subtils leurs contrats? Quelle forme de conscience du droit accompagne les mouvements d'indignés ou Occupy de ces dernières années? S'agit-il de formes d'action quasi primitives, comme on a tendance à les décrire, reposant sur l'agrégation de mécontentement, ou ne s'agirait-il pas plutôt de mobilisation visant à confronter la démocratie libérale à ses principes rationnels légaux, soit à ses propres contradictions, et notamment au formidable déséquilibre qu'elle n'a su empêcher, comme l'exprime le mot d'ordre « Nous sommes les 99%». Il se pourrait donc bien qu'aujourd'hui, comme hier, la mise en œuvre du droit par les mouvements sociaux repose toujours sur la même tension entre l'égalité et légitimité, entre le droit comme légitimité et source de légitimation dans nos sociétés et l'illégitimité des déséquilibres qu'il ne parvient pas à contenir. So to conclude, I would say I would like to point that those trends, those general and quite visible trends that I try to trace should not lead us to forget the more fragmented and bottom-up practices of law that put into question the legitimacy of law as a means of regulation in our societies. And the movements such as Occupy, the Indignados, I wrote it before knowing what would be the subject of Boaventura, but of course it resonates with what he will deliver in his paper, also to be taken into account, even if apparently they are not real legal mobilization in the most visible sense, but they do work on the tension between what law is supposed to regulate our societies and all the tensions and all the injustice that are still existing in our societies. So thank you for your attention, and I think it's you're beginning, Musa, with your paper. So thank you for the presentations that will come, and I hope will resonate with the few things I try to put in introduction.
Thank you very much,
Alors, je vais parler sur les ulémas du palais, révolution arabe et droit musulman. Ça veut dire comment les éléments de l'establishment, les ulémas étatiques qui sont nommés par l'État ou qui appartiennent à l'État, comment ils se sont comportés en face du phénomène qu'on appelle maintenant les révolutions arabes. Ça, c'est une forme de mobilisation sociale, c'est le maximum de mobilisation sociale, c'est la révolution. Alors, à cet égard, il y a des débats, disons, sur la fonction de la religion. Est-ce que la religion, en général, est-ce que c'est la religion comme l'opium du peuple? Ou est-ce que la religion peut amener à la résistance? Est-ce que la religion produit de la fausse conscience et justifie les régimes politiques et économiques en place? C'est la manière de Marx. Ou est-ce que la religion est une source de dynamique sociale, Durkheim? Je vais soutenir que la religion dépend du contexte dans lequel elle s'opère. Si on regarde les institutions religieuses étatiques, normalement, ils font ce que les pouvoirs en place les permettent de le faire. Alors, ces institutions, s'ils ont une autonomie, parfois, c'est sur des choses sans grande importance et pour la survie du régime ou son existence. Il n'y a pas un vrai défi. Il pourrait y avoir des remarques ici et là, mais pas sur l'existence du régime. Alors, le droit musulman qui est produit par ces institutions est le résultat de ces fluctuations. Alors, aujourd'hui, il ne fait aucun doute que le droit musulman se développe, suivant les circonstances politiques, sociales et économiques. Parler au nom de Dieu et de son prophète ne veut pas surtout dire ne pas prendre en compte des données de la réalité sociale et politique. Ce sont des vérités de la palisse pour des gens de droit et société, mais pas pour les paradigmes orientalistes régnant sur la production scientifique occidentale en tout ce qui concerne le monde arabe et le monde musulman, qui soutient que le droit musulman ne se développe pas. L'arrêt du développement a été fait soit au Xe, soit au XIIe siècle, ça dépend des auteurs. Alors, disons... oui. Ok. Alors, I want to speak about the establishment ulama and their relation to the social mobilization. And one form, greatest form of social mobilization is revolution. And how this ulama of establishment react to the phenomenon of revolution which happened in Arab state, in some Arab state, whether it is they have a quietist approach or activist approach. So whether it is Marx or Durkheim. So this is and how to, I want to check it through this example of Arab Revolution. But I want to come back a little bit in history, and I just 2-3 minutes about history, because I know the sociologists of law are interested what is happening today, because the dominant position concerning Islamic law and revolution, or Islamic law and social mobilization, is usually what is perceived in Western scholarship, that the ulama, the jurists, the Muslim jurists, are usually legitimating the power in place, whether he is dictator or not. So I will quote two classical legal ulama. One is 1111, which is called Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, 1111. And he say, an evil doing and barbarous sultan, which is a ruler, so long as he is supported by military force, so that he can only with difficulty be deposed, and that the attempt to depose him would create an unendurable civil strife, must of necessity be left in possession, and obedience must be rendered to him. So if he has force, he must be without depose him. And Al-Ghazali is a 12th century scholar, 11th century scholar. He tried to explain, and he gave a justification. He said, which is the better part that we should declare, that the judge are divested of their functions, that all the governor are invalid, that no marriage can be legally contracted, that all executive action in all parts of the earth are void. So this is if we choose not to recognize the person in power, even if he exercises illegally his power, or to recognize that the imam, which is the governor, is held by on a valid contract, and all executive acts and jurisdiction are valid. So this is perceived as justification of dictatorship, used or misused by a scholar of today. Another 14th century scholar say, when the governor is thus contractually assumed by one person in virtue of his military power and conquest, and there is subsequently rises up another who overcomes the first by his might and his army, then the first is deposed and the second becomes the new ruler. So there is no place here, no room for law. The person in power, he will be controlling. So, yes, I forget, I continue in English. I have to switch to French. J'ai cité quelques exemples dans l'histoire de la pensée juridique musulmane, quelques auteurs qui soutenaient, des grands auteurs, qui soutenaient que la personne au pouvoir, une fois qu'il a la force militaire, on lui doit obéissance. Et donc, c'est les faits, le pouvoir, et les droits dans ces cas suivent les pouvoirs. Et ce n'est pas à l'envers. Donc, le droit ici, ce n'est pas quelque chose, une norme qui façonne ou qui influence les pouvoirs, ou la réalité, c'est le contraire. Donc, il n'y a pas grande place à l'aspect normatif dans cette perspective. Et ça, ces citations que j'ai données, ils sont utilisées pour montrer que la culture musulmane, la culture juridique musulmane, ou la culture musulmane, s'oppose à toute révolution. Et ça, ce qui n'est pas tout à fait vrai, parce qu'on peut donner des contre-citations, aussi, pas seulement d'aujourd'hui, mais des contre-citations qui proviennent de cette époque classique. Donc, mais je passe à la période, disons, contemporaine, et je vais parler sur, comme je dis, sur les révolutions arabes et l'attitude des ulémas à l'égard de ces révolutions. Alors, les ulémas...
Je peux le redire en anglais, ça, ce que tu viens de dire.
Oui, oui. Now I will switch. I will speak mainly in my presentation concerning the current position of establishment ulama concerning the revolution. And oui. Alors, les ulémas du palais ont soutenu toujours les pouvoirs en place, quels que soient ces pouvoirs. Et la théorie des ulémas concernant les pouvoirs est d'éviter des discordes, en ayant en tête la grande discorde qui était au 7e siècle, où les grands compagnons du prophète se sont combattus. Et celui qui détient les pouvoirs militaires détient la légitimité de gouverner. Alors, quels que soient ces pouvoirs, si c'est un pouvoir, disons, par exemple, je vais prendre l'exemple d'Al-Azhar en Égypte, je vais prendre l'exemple du comité des hauts ulémas en Arabie Saoudite. Par exemple, si on prend Al-Azhar, c'est la plus grande et prestigieuse institution sunnite, alors cette institution a toujours soutenu les pouvoirs en place. Si on commence le début de cette institution a été fondée comme institution religieuse sunnite pour propager, faire des recherches et enseigner la religion musulmane chiite. Et donc, c'est Al-Azhar, c'était comme institution chiite. Puis, Al-Azhar est devenu comme une institution pour propager la religion musulmane sunnite au XIIIe siècle. Et ça, c'est un exemple où Al-Azhar défend ceux qui sont au pouvoir. Un autre exemple, Al-Azhar a soutenu, par exemple, les pouvoirs monarchiques au XIXe et XXe siècle, les pouvoirs monarchiques en place. Puis, Al-Azhar a soutenu les pouvoirs républicains après le coup d'État de Nasser en 1952. Et la République est devenue un fondement de l'islam. Avec la République est devenu un fondement de l'islam et le socialisme est aussi devenu un fondement de l'islam. Et Al-Azhar a donné des opinions où le socialisme, le premier socialiste du monde, c'est le prophète Mohammed. Puis, avec Sadat, 1970, avec la libéralisation économique, le capitalisme est devenu fondement de l'islam. Donc, ça c'est Al-Azhar. Donc, chaque fois qu'il y a, disons, il justifie toujours systématiquement ceux qui sont au pouvoir. Alors, c'est d'une manière, donc, I was saying that Al-Azhar is justifying systematically the power of the state, whether it is Shiite, so he will become Shiite, whether it is Sunnite, he will become Shiite, whether it is capitalist, socialist, and he will become socialist or capitalist according to the development in the political level of Egyptian state. So, the caricatural, d'une manière caricaturale, c'est présenté par le cheikh d'Al-Azhar actuel. Il a changé 3 fois, pendant 2 ans, 3 fois, sa position. Alors, il était membre du comité des grandes politiques du Parti national au pouvoir pendant le régime de Moubarak. Ça veut dire qu'il appartenait au pouvoir, au centre du pouvoir de Moubarak. Au début des événements révolutionnaires, il appelait à ne pas manifester pour éviter que le sang ne soit pas coulé. Alors, une fois la révolution a réussi, donc son revirement, il a pris l'initiative de rédiger avec diverses composantes de la société un document très important, un document révolutionnaire. Si on enlève le nom d'Al-Azhar, vous pouvez penser que c'est un document qui est composé par les révolutionnaires français. Alors, il a écrit 4 documents très révolutionnaires, je pense que tous ceux qui sont ici vont souscrire à ça. Donc, I was saying that this position, this transformation in the position of Al-Azhar is a caricatural manner which was done by the present the president Sheikh of Al-Azhar, and he changed 3 times in 2 years. One against the revolution, and another time for the revolution, and the 3rd time for the military coup d'etat which was happened in Egypt in July. So in this document, now produced a revolutionary discourse. So I will just mention a few elements of this document. And he was mentioning that the importance of reform and the importance of constitution of a national, constitutional, democratic, modern state. And the state should be based on a constitution which is accepted by the nation, the Ummah. And there should be a separation of powers. And there should be equality and equality in the rights. and the legislative power is belonging to the people and not to God. And Islam never recognized a theocratical regime. And it is, the regime should respect the interest of the people, okay? And the regime should be based on democratic basis. And there should be pluralism, definition of competence by law, control of the state, transparency, fight against corruption. There should be also fundamental freedom, respect of freedom of opinion, freedom of religion, freedom of human right, woman right, children right. So you have all it is in this text. And they should respect divergence, dialogue. There should be also respect of international treaties which deal with human rights. Okay, so this is a revolutionary production. I can. So j'ai parlé sur le document révolutionnaire qui a été produit par le cheikh d'Al-Azhar dans sa seconde phase. Un document révolutionnaire qui contient une grande liste de libertés, des droits de l'homme, liberté, démocratie, que le pouvoir législatif est entre les mains du législateur et du peuple. Et ce n'est pas Dieu, pluralisme, passage du pouvoir est pacifique, contrôle de l'État, respect des non-musulmans, et donc aussi respect des traités internationaux qui concernent les droits de l'homme. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est que dans ce texte important, Al-Azhar fait une autre approche, disons, il donne une autre approche qui est l'approche traditionnelle concernant l'obéissance au gouverneur. Normalement, il y a un verset, c'est dans le chapitre 4, verset 59 du Coran, qui dit que pour les croyants, il faut obéir à Dieu et les prophètes, et ceux qui sont au pouvoir. Ça, c'est un verset. Et Al-Azhar dit, ce verset est disons, compris et commenté, disons, d'une manière qui n'est pas exacte, et il fait référence au verset 58, et qui dit qu'il faut juger le peuple par justice. Ça, c'est le verset dans le même Coran. Il y a le verset 59 et le verset 58. Alors, Al-Azhar dit, voilà, il y a un autre verset 58, dit que les gens qui sont au pouvoir doivent être justes. Et donc, s'ils n'ont pas juste, donc ils peuvent être déposés, il faut être destitué. Ça, c'est une interprétation révolutionnaire qui provient du Coran lui-même. Juste, il faut regarder un verset avant le verset 59. So I was saying that Al-Azhar give another interpretation concerning verses from the Quran. The verse who say, "O you who believe, obey God and obey the messenger and those in authority among you." So this verse was used or misused or abused, telling that the person must be submitted to the person in power. And Al-Azhar, in this important revolutionary document, was mentioning another verse, which is in the same chapter, and have number 58, telling that the person who is in power must be just in his ruling. And if he is not just, so the interpretation could say that a person can remove him from power. Okay? So, il y a un autre document d'Al-Azhar dans lequel il soutient, Al-Azhar soutient aussi les révolutions dans le monde arabe. Ce qui se passe en Tunisie, en Égypte, en Libye, en Syrie, en Yémen. Donc, ça devient légitime et légal de mobiliser la population pour, disons, destituer les gouverneurs. Alors, ça c'est deuxième phase du cheikh d'Al-Azhar. Troisième phase, c'est 3 juillet en Égypte, quand l'armée a pris le pouvoir, destituant et emprisonnant le premier président civil démocratiquement élu. L'annonce de ce coup d'État a été faite par le général Sisi. Et donc, autour de ce coup d'État, il y avait l'autorité religieuse chrétienne, copte, il y avait aussi Cheikh Al-Azhar qui a soutenu ces coups d'État. et au niveau des justifications, pour le Cheikh Al-Azhar, il a dit qu'il faut choisir le moindre mal. Donc, et dans ce discours, le Cheikh Al-Azhar, donc tout ce qui appartenait aux libertés publiques, disons, aux droits de l'homme, tout ça, ça a été oublié, et il appelle, disons, aux manifestants, il les appelle à non utiliser la violence. Il n'appelle jamais aux autorités égyptiennes de ne pas faire, disons, ne pas utiliser la violence. Alors, the third stage of this development is when there was a coup d'etat in July, 3rd July, July 3rd, and when the Al-Azhar authority was legitimizing all the use of power, use of force against the demonstrator in Egypt, and never he criticized the authority, the establishment, the state. Okay, there are also other establishment personalities who made the same. Okay, so there are. This is an example which in here you see the three differences, and we have. There are also a counter fatwa. There are counter fatwa by other Muslim scholars. One of them is Al-Qaradawi, and he gave another fatwa. But Al-Qaradawi is not perceived as ulama from the establishment. He is like autonomous ulama, and he was criticizing this coup d'etat against the elected president. So another case. Oui, j'ai mentionné qu'il y a un autre fatwa de Qaradawi qui a dénoncé, dans une fatwa très détaillée, qui a dénoncé les coups d'État. Alors, another example is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, in difference of, there is a difference between the structure of the relation between the ulama in Egypt and the ulama in Saudi Arabia. The ulama in Saudi Arabia are part of the power and the state. They are not an establishment within other establishment. And this was a contract between family Saud, the king family, and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, 18th century scholar. He was make like a contract between this family. The scholar will be free to propagate their Wahhabi, purist Salafist religion, and they will give legitimacy to the Saudian state. So concerning, the scholar all the time defend the authority in place with one exception that I will mention later. So after the revolution, after the Arab Revolution in Egypt and Tunisia, there was a demonstration in Saudi Arabia, and the state tried to fight against this demonstration by a security measure and also by financial measure. And the third way, they took a fatwa from the High Committee of Ulama in Saudi Arabia. Okay? So in this fatwa, the ulama say that their function is to reveal the truth, and the truth is that the Muslim should obey to the ruler. So this is a classical reading of classical Islamic law. And it is important to preserve the unity of the kingdom, and there should be a protection of Muslim identity without influence, neither East nor West. It means West, which is a democratic regime, East, which is a new revolution, and there should be no deviance in thinking, and they have to support the regime, and the demonstration are something which is not Islamic, because the demonstration was not in Muslim history. So this is according to this fatwa. There is a counter fatwa, many counter fatwa, which say that also Islam is supporting or legitimizing also counter critics of the person in place. there is one in 19th century. In 19th century, the family, Saud family, was removed from the power, and there was another family, Madawi family, in 19th century in Saudi Arabia, and the ulama supported the Madawi family. Although there was a contract between Wahhabi and Saudi, but they forget this contract because the power was changing. Okay, another example of supporting it is between the conflict between Ibn Saud and Faisal in the 60s. The ulama supported Faisal. So the ulama, they support each time the person who are in power. So whether he is from the family Saud or not, it could be whatever, another person or not. So, okay. So, je disais que dans l'autre exemple que j'ai pris, c'était l'Arabie Saoudite. À la différence de l'Égypte, en Arabie Saoudite, les ulémas sont partis du pouvoir. Les ulémas participent au pouvoir. Les ulémas, ils ont, en vertu d'un contrat mythique entre les rois d'Arabie Saoudite et les ulémas au XVIIIe siècle, et donc entre Mohammed Abdel Wahhab, disons les dirigeants du mouvement, ce qu'on appelle wahhabite, et le roi Ibn Saoud, qui est, disons, le grand arrière-grand-père de ce qui règne aujourd'hui. Alors, c'était en vertu de ces contrats, et les ulémas peuvent propager leur vision de l'islam, c'est une vision spécifique de l'islam, vision spécifique de l'islam, et en contrepartie, ils vont légitimer les pouvoirs. Alors, pendant les révolutions arabes, qui se sont passées en Égypte et en Tunisie, alors il y avait une annonce qu'il devrait y avoir une grande manifestation en Arabie Saoudite. L'État a réagi par trois moyens. Le moyen le plus simple, c'est le moyen sécuritaire, ça veut dire par la police, par la répression. Un deuxième moyen, c'est les moyens financiers. Ils ont consacré 36 000 milliards de dollars pour améliorer, disons, la situation sociale. Et troisième moyen, c'est le moyen des fatwas, par les hauts comités des ulémas. Les hauts comités des ulémas, par cette fatwa, est interdit de faire la manifestation en disant que c'est un phénomène qui est non islamique et que l'histoire musulmane ne connaît pas la manifestation. Donc il ne faut pas imiter les non-musulmans parce que c'est un péché. Et donc ça c'est. Mais il y a d'autres fatwas contre cette fatwa. Il y a d'autres fatwas contre cette fatwa qui justifient la révolution. Je ne sais pas si j'ai le temps pour.
In English, so
okay.
This is part.
Okay. So there are another counter fatwa which saying that the demonstration and revolution are legal. So what I want to say here in conclusion is that Islamic law is functioning like any other system. For example, if we see, for example, a judge after a revolution, for example, or revolution or coup d'etat or even military intervention, if we see, for example, the judge concerning Saddam Hussein, for Saddam Hussein, the judge who judged him are illegal. But for the judge who took the judgment, there are the constitutional power. They have the constitutional authority to judge him. There is no one example in history, in court, where there is a revolution, the court said that the revolution is illegal. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, so when there is a revolution, always judge are legitimizing the revolution. So it is the same thing here like Islamic law. Islamic law is functioning like any other legal system. It is not, there is no exception here. So, en conclusion, je disais que les droits musulmans fonctionnent comme tout système juridique qui légitime, disons, les pouvoirs des personnes en place. Les pouvoirs judiciaires peuvent critiquer ici et là quelques disons, des remarques ou quelques décisions qui peuvent limiter certaines limites qui sont marginales. Il n'y a jamais une décision de justice qui remet en cause les pouvoirs en place. Donc les droits musulmans fonctionnent comme un droit, si vous voulez, normal. Voilà, merci.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. En effet, professeur Boaventura de Sousa Santos m'a demandé de lire son papier. Il ne peut pas être ici et il m'a demandé de le faire. I'm going to read in English, if you don't mind. Professor Boaventura expresses his warmest regards to the panel and also to the audience. His paper, he entitled it Toward the Social Legal Theory of Indignation, or Is It Possible to Occupy the Law? In this paper, I present a rough draft of a social legal theory of law in the light of the newest wave of social protests, which some authors have designated as the newest social movements. All these protests took place between 2011 and 2013, and were so intense and dispersed in 2011 that Chase Doon characterizes this period as the World Revolution 2011, a date that would symbolize important eruptions of popular mobilization and protest, such as 1789, 1848, 1917, 1968, and 1989, leading on to structural changes in the world at large. The protests I have in mind are the Arab Spring in North Africa and the Middle East, the Occupy Wall Street, subsequently expanding to many other cities in the USA, the Indignados movement in Southern Europe, and finally, in June 2013, the massive protests in Brazil around public transportation and public services in general. I then tried to outline the main traits of the conception or conceptions of law and legal transformation that may be implicit in such protests, and finally offer some criticisms as a rearguard committed theorist activist. The words dignity, indignation, and indignity were used extensively in the protests. For this reason, I designate the most recent wave of social protest as the indignation revolts. As used here, indignation does not refer exclusively to the Indignados movement of Southern Europe. It is rather the general designation covering all the protests between 2011 and 2013, and it may be used to express the revulsion against an extremely unjust state of affairs, indignation, and to characterize a state of affairs that deprives a person or a group from her or his basic human dignity, indignity. The register is ethical and mobilizes reasons and passions both abundantly present in the protests. It puts the emphasis of the collective action on the radical rejection of a given status quo, rather than on the imagination of a future better society. This negativity is at the core of the conception of law that is implicit in the protests, even though the significant differences among them may invite greater specification. As one might expect, the protesters were not in the least interested in entertaining a reflection about the law and its role in society, other than stating as a self-evident truth law's complete irrelevance to their struggle. If law, like no other attribute of the modern state, symbolizes the idea of institution and institutionalization, law and order, it is to be expected that the indignation movements have very little to say about law, even when they have a lot to say about rights. Their recourse to direct action of occupation underlies the anti-institutional or extra-institutional impulse behind their protests. Moreover, the justification for that recourse, particularly in democratic contexts, is that the institutions are not performing the functions for which they were designed. They have been taken over by the power elite to serve their interests. What I propose here is, therefore, a hypothetical reconstruction. If the indignation revolts would have time or interest in developing a critical theory of law underlying their struggles, how would it look like? How would they conceive of law? What is, according to them, the role of law in society? What is the concept of law that underlies their collective action? How is law related to the state and civil society? My interest in these questions is both political and analytical. I have been politically active in some of the indignation revolts, particularly in Southern Europe, and I've exercised my solidarity to the best of my ability. I share many of their concerns and struggles and experience a similarly intense sense of indignation, and for the same reasons. As far as the critical theory of law and the questions formulated above are concerned, I have a specific political and analytical interest. The indignation revolts seem to contradict the critical sociological theory of law I have been developing over years. One of the main features of such theory is the idea that under certain conditions, law can be used to promote progressive social transformation, what I have been designating as the counter-hegemonic use of law. Elaborating on such possibility, the last chapter of my book, Towards a New Legal Common Sense, is entitled, Can Law Be Emancipatory? To this question, the Indignation Revolts answer with a resounding no. To entertain the hypothesis that the conditions for the counter-hegemonic use of law might be present in our societies is, from their perspective, a liberal reformist fantasy with no bearing in real life. If they are right, am I wrong? Law and the Indignation Revolts. Central to the conception of law underlying the Indignation Revolts is the configuration of power relations prevailing in society. The law of the state is a crucial component of such configuration. The law is not autonomous in relation to prevailing power relations in society in any relevant sense. Law is politics by other means. But such embeddedness may be viewed from three different perspectives. In order to identify them, I distinguish among three types of law: configurative law, reconfigurative law, and prefigurative law. Configurative law reflects a given configuration of power relations. If these power relations are unequal and bound to produce injustice and oppression, law will be equally unjust and oppressive. Reconfigurative law reflects the reconfiguration of the correlation of forces in society. It underlies what I have been calling the counter-hegemonic use of law. Prefigurative law is expressive of performative law, expressing in its practice the anticipation of a different society based on a totally different set of power relations. In the following, I will refer to them separately. Configurative law, the abyssal duality of law. According to the Indignation Revolts, in current capitalist societies, there is an abyssal legal duality, a kind of legal pluralism that legal scholars have never identified and much less studied. The official state law has been preoccupied by the power elites, the oppressors, whoever they are. This preoccupation operates through a radical divide between two legal systems, the law of the 1% and the law of the 99%, the law of the oppressor and the law of the oppressed. This divide is both radical and invisible. They are incommensurable and intrinsically bounded together. They are bounded together not just because they coexist in the same geopolitical space. They are indeed produced by the same legislative power and adjudicated by the same judicial system. They both operate through systematic deviations from the general principles in which they are supposed to be grounded. And yet they remain incommensurate. The discrepancy between law in books and law in action, rather than the deviation or aberration, is constitutive of this type of preoccupation. By negating the constitutive nature of the discrepancy between law in books and law in action, and, on the contrary, by proclaiming the unity, neutrality, autonomy, and universality of the law, dominant political ideology and expert legal knowledge occult the coexistence of the two legal systems and neutralize any attempt at alternative ways of occupying the law by those excluded from power, the oppressed, by far the large majority of the population. The abyssal line that divides the two legal systems bears some similarities with the one that divided the metropolitan law from the colonial law in the period of historical colonialism, except that now the two laws are exercised in the same geopolitical territory. In the play of legal mirrors prevalent in society, there is no way law can be reflected in its entirety. As a result, it remains invisible that law and order is the other side of law of disorder, that in our societies the rule of law goes side by side with the rule of illegality. In the last 60 years, the abyssal divide at the heart of law in capitalist societies has never been as radical and damaging for the vast majorities of our societies as it is today. It is the result of a 30-year-long counter-revolution of the 1% against the social gains the 99% had obtained in previous decades through struggles carried out within the boundaries of the liberal democratic process. Through such struggles, some measure of social redistribution was achieved, translated in the expansion of social and economic rights. Prevailing power relations were thereby changed in the core countries of the world system, the best expression of such change being the European style of social democracy and welfare state. In the last 30 years, the power elites, seconded by the global financial capital, have managed to reverse this historical process, hijacking democracy and putting it at the service of their exclusive interests. As a result, we live today in societies that are politically democratic and socially fascist. This political split is the mirror image of the legal split, the workings of dual legality. Let us now examine in greater detail in what consists the duality between the law of the 1% and the law of the 99%. In spite of its radical nature, this split has been achieved without any suspension of the Constitution, without any declaration of the state of exception. The law of the 1% is a status law, a personal law in the Weberian sense. The law of the 99% is territorial law. It is the way of operation of the law when it addresses the needs and the aspirations of the 99%. The law of the 1% is conceived by the powerful as its own. As a consequence, the application of law is ruled by the idea of who does what against whom, rather than by the idea of what is done against no matter whom. According to the indignation conception of law, the balanced articulation among the three structural elements of modern state law, rhetoric, bureaucracy, and violence, if it ever existed, is today completely absent. On the contrary, there is in fact a structural disparity between the three components. The law of the 1% operates almost exclusively through rhetoric. In recent years, the proliferation of soft law and forms of governance based on voluntary compliance has dramatically shown the prevalence of rhetoric in the law of the 1%. On the contrary, the law of the 99% operates through bureaucracy and violence, and in recent times more through violence than bureaucracy, as illustrated by the criminalization of social protest. Rhetoric is at most used to induce resignation before the excessive use of bureaucratic violence by state bureaucracies or physical violence by the police. 1. As there are two laws, there are two illegalities, the illegality of the powerful and the illegality of the powerless. The illegality of the powerful operates in two ways, through impunity or, in few cases, through immunity and illegitimate legal change to fit their interests. In the first case, they use their overriding interpersonal, financial, and organizational resources to twist legal adjudication to their advantage. In the second case, they manipulate the legislative process by either illegal corruption, bribes, traffic, or influences, or legal corruption, lobbying. Only when an illegality committed by some powerful person or group affects the interests of some other powerful person or group is it treated according to the principle of equality before the law. On the contrary, the illegality of the powerful committed against the powerless remains largely without punishment, be it wage theft, salary and pension cuts in violation of contracts and agreements, excessive credit commissions or overcharges, illegal foreclosures, excessively long prison sentences for minor offenses, and so on. On the contrary, the law of the 99% treats the illegality of the powerless with excessive harshness. Minor violations of the law, of criminal, civil, or administrative nature, tend to be severely punished. The outstanding example in recent years is the criminalization of social protest. The application of severe anti-terrorism laws against political dissent or social activism has become the norm, involving not only severe punishment for minor disturbances of public order, but also police brutality and the grotesque violation of privacy through the most intrusive forms of surveillance. Moreover, in many instances, the protesters act in self-defense, resisting against illegal acts of the powerful which the law of the 1% leaves unpunished. This is dramatically illustrated in the cases of peasants and indigenous people blocking roads to prevent the devastation of their forests by agribusiness or timber industries, or resisting against expulsion from their lands and territories by promoters of large-scale mining, industrial agriculture, dams or other mega projects being carried out without their consent or consultation, as required by international law and, in most cases, with the complicity of corrupt governments. 2. The legal, the illegal, and the illegal. Another feature of abyssal law is its propensity to engage in forms of social control that do not fit into the conventional legal-illegal dichotomy. These are forms of social control in which uncontrolled discretionary behavior is considered the only effective one, and indeed, the more arbitrary, the more effective. This is the field of illegality. Just two examples from different areas of social control. While managing financial and budgetary crises, the power elite may resort to emergency measures of dubious legality with the sole purpose of imposing immense sacrifices on the 99%. While exempting the 1%, even when a minor sacrifice on the part of the latter would have diminished considerably the overall negative effects of the crisis. The other example takes place in the so-called war on terror. In this case, the social control may become so arbitrary that to consider it illegal does not capture its full character. It's being completely out of bounds. Just a few examples: secret laws and secret interpretation of the laws, whereby the accused before a secret court is not allowed, and neither is his or her lawyer, to know the law on the basis of which he or she is being accused and eventually condemned. The access by the secret services to all the electronic communications of everybody, suspect or non-suspect of any wrongdoing, as recently exposed by Ed Snowden, the way Osama bin Laden was assassinated and his body destroyed, the cyberspace, Guantanamo, and the transit lounges of international airports seem to be the privileged sites of spaces of illegality, twilight zones beyond the legal-illegal dichotomy that ground modern legal principles. The illegal spaces and courses of action are bound to expand as democracy gets hollowed out, the state of exception gets normalized, and citizenship slides into servitude. 3. In the field of international relations, the law of the 1% is the law of plundering and dispossession. International law is the most deliberate and violent instance of the abyssal division between the law of the 1% and the law of the 99%. As far as international law is concerned, the law of the 1% protects at the transnational level the interests of the power elites of the core countries and their satellite elites in the periphery and semi-periphery of the world system. This law operates by underwriting the most violent forms of capital accumulation, which Marx designated as primitive accumulation. According to Marx, these were forms of particularly violent and illegal capital accumulation, like taking over communal lands followed by the expulsion of peasants in order to expand the textile industry in 19th century England, which created the conditions for the more normal, peaceful, legal, and sustainable reproduction of capitalist economic relations. It was therefore conceived as an initial phase of capitalism. It is now evident that such primitive accumulation, rather than a phase, it was a constant feature of capitalism when analyzed on a global scale, and continues today under different forms. First and foremost, there is neo-colonialism and imperialist warfare to guarantee access to natural resources. Secondly, land grabbing throughout Africa and Latin America and the massive expulsion of peasants and indigenous peoples from the land they had cultivated for generations and generations in order to pave the way for the unprecedented, in both scale and intensity, exploration of natural resources, be they mega projects of infrastructure, huge dams and highways, large-scale open-sky mining, new plantation industrial agriculture for agrofuels and animal feed. Thirdly, the unprecedented transfer of wealth from impoverished middle and popular classes to the 1% by stealing salaries and pensions, cutting down social benefits, forcing people out of their foreclosed homes, all in order to solve the financial crisis, that is, by bailing out banks and remunerating speculators, the same ones that caused the crisis in the first place by their irresponsible, if not criminal behavior. Prefigurative law. The previous analysis shows that, from the perspective of the indignation revolts, law is basically configurative law, a law split in two with the purpose of oppressing the majorities in the name of a supposedly common good, which in real terms is the exclusive good of the 1%. Configurative law is thus a fundamentally hostile ground for protesters, and they should have no illusions about the possibility of resorting to it for the benefit of their causes. In one instance, however, law may be self-given and thus not imposed. This is the law of the occupation. It is a bottom-up law generated in the exercise of occupation itself. The occupation of the public space involves the creation of an alternative place during a certain period by a sizable number of people. Such an occupation requires the enactment of some regulation and ordering, rules facilitating legitimate behavior and punishing the illegitimate one, as well as some kind of law enforcement mechanism in order to guarantee the implementation of such rules. To the extent they involved occupation or sustained resistance, the indignation revolts tended to generate such rules in assembly-based forms of participation and deliberation, brought about by consensus with modifications to prevent small minorities from transforming their dissent into a veto power of any decision. Such rules and rulemaking are the foundational social contract of the occupation. Like the law of the 1%, this occupation law is self-given, a self-rule, and operates on the basis of rhetoric. It is almost devoid of bureaucracy and violence. This law is prefigurative in the sense that both in its design and exercise, it bears witness to a realist anticipation of an alternative law in an alternative society, where democracy, justice, and equality were actually living experiences. This is the only form of legal pluralism to which the indignation movement grants some positive value. In spite of its precarious and unclear appearance, this prefigurative law belongs to the same type of prefigurative law that existed in some liberated zones during the anti-colonial liberation movement and has been enforced for some years in the autonomous territories of the Neo-Zapatistas. Can law be emancipatory? I have been claiming that the counter-hegemonic use of law presupposes, among other conditions, that legal mobilization must be a part of a broader political mobilization. Legal mobilization involves going to court to advance demands rather than to defend against criminal charges, put pressure on the state bureaucracies in charge of implementing rights, or mobilize for legislative change. Political mobilization may involve different kinds of peaceful political activism, including direct action to advance their causes in the political agenda. What the indignation revolts are saying is that the conditions for legal mobilization either do not exist or are deteriorating to such an extent that political mobilization must take explicit precedence over legal mobilization. This is a result of the rise of authoritarianism that has led to the top-down extra-institutionalism or deinstitutionalization disguised by the invisible split between the law of the 1% and the law of the 99%. As a result, social transformation through legal and judicial activism cannot be achieved under existing conditions of global capitalism. The conditions for a counter-hegemonic use of law, if it has ever existed, have deteriorated to such an extent that nothing is left but a sad liberal fantasy, a hollow hope. Liberal democracy has proved powerless to neutralize the impulses of neoliberal capitalism towards ever greater concentration of wealth and undemocratic political power. Citizenship and human rights are being eroded, even in the core countries of the world system. Surveillance destroys privacy beyond recognition. Elected governments respond to rating agencies rather than to citizens. Corruption seems endemic. Transfers of wealth from the poor to the rich attain scandalous levels, which were thought before to be possible only under dictatorship. And imperialist wars are being reinvented continuously. All this takes place without formally suspending constitutional rules and guarantees. Under these conditions, no significant reconfigurative law is possible. Law can only be recovered as an emancipatory tool if democracy is refounded and, in a sense, reinvented. This explains the centrality of the calls for real democracy in the indignation movement. Real democracy means essentially a political regime that effectively promotes political, social, and economic equality and respect for equal difference by transforming unequal power relations into relations of shared authority in society at large, and not just in the political realm. In other words, without profoundly reconfiguring power relations in a more equitable and democratic way, no reconfigurative law is possible. The appeal is not, therefore, to constitutional lawyering as usual, but rather to a radical democracy and a profound state reform brought about by a bottom-up, participative political process through which the 99% will exercise a robust constituent power. Some have called this process transformative constitutionalism, having in mind some recent constitutional processes in Latin America, like in Ecuador and Bolivia. Coming back to my conception of the counter-hegemonic use of law, I don't view the indignation revolts as meaning a complete denial of my theory. I rather view them as demanding a crucial revision in such theory. Without effectively changing the most political dimension of the law, constitutional law, founding both the state and the political system, no other progressive social transformation through law is to be expected. In the end, the indignation revolts, rather than supporting the counter-hegemonic use of law in general, focus their struggles on one specific counter-hegemonic use of a specific branch of law, constitutional law. The goal of transformative constitutionalism is premised upon such counter-hegemonic use. Only a reconfigurative constitutional law, combined with the continued bottom-up pressure that led to it, will reinstall in society the general possibility of a counter-hegemonic use of law. I thank you on behalf of Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos And he will be glad to get any comments or questions that you want to pose. Of course, I am not able to respond to any comments you have, but he will be glad to read them if you use his email address. Thank you.
You will be very gratified.